The next session discusses building inclusive and resilient economies in the digital era. Joining this discussion will be a panel consisting of policymakers as well as corporate leaders. This panel will be moderated by Aiaze Mitha, United Nations Capital Development Fund Ambassador and Senior Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing of Sustainable Development Goals. The panelists are Barame Sok of Kweli Inc., Fabrizio Hochschild, Under Secretary General for Digital Cooperation, United Nations, AirAsia Digital President Aireen Omar, and Patrick Njoroge, Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya. Let's now join the panel to learn more about the roles of government and citizens in an inclusive and healthy nation.
My great pleasure and honor to be here with you and with such distinguished panelists to discuss such an important topic. Perhaps to get us kicked off, I'd like to turn to you, Fabrizio. You've been leading the UN Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation, and obviously inclusive digital economies has been a major aspect of some of the work that you've done. Would you mind sharing some thoughts on some of the key considerations that have emerged from the roadmap as it relates to digital economies and in particular inclusive digital economies?
Thank you very much. And I think this discussion is very timely. I mean, the roadmap, if there's one theme that dominates the roadmap, it is inclusion. Inequality and inclusion are probably, next to climate change, and the Secretary General has said this, the greatest challenge of our time. While the world has done a pretty good job up until COVID in eradicating or diminishing poverty, in terms of equality and inclusion, we've gone backwards. Since the financial crisis, inequality has grown worse in 2 out of 3 countries. And of course, with COVID, everything has been greatly exacerbated. COVID has seen the 2,000 richest people on earth increase their fortunes by about $2.7 trillion, while at the same time, according to the World Bank, the number of people living in extreme poverty has grown for the first time in many decades and is likely to grow by 150 million. That's equivalent to the population of a number of medium-sized countries. Now, this is relevant because inequality is mirrored and to a great extent exacerbated by the digital sphere. The connectivity or the lack of it traces and exacerbates existing patterns of inclusion and exclusion. And I think what we have to bear in mind is the notion of a digital economy. I don't want to be overly provocative, but the notion of a digital economy is increasingly, I don't know how to say this diplomatically, spurious. The point being that the economy is digital. The analog economy is rapidly disappearing. 8 out of 10 of the highest valued companies in the world are digital. And the 2 that are not digital, Walmart and Coca-Cola, could not function anymore without digital technologies. So there is, the analog economy is a bit like subsistence agriculture. It exists, but it's increasingly marginal. So if we're not digitized, it's not that we don't have access to something called the digital economy. It's that we increasingly won't have access to any sort of economy. And I think that under COVID has become very clear. People who are connected, like most of us, could continue working. People who were not connected, with few exceptions, couldn't continue working. People who were connected could continue their education. People who were not connected could not, etc. So the issue of connectivity is the new face of exclusion and inequality, and it needs to be tackled comprehensively. And I think the scorecard that you've put up, the ID scorecard, points to exactly the issues that are required resolving. Infrastructure, but although infrastructure is often overstated as a constraint, the Broadband Commission has made clear that 93% of the world, I think, now is theoretically connected to broadband. The constraints are about affordability, about devices, about policy, about skills training. And these are all issues where the Secretary General's roadmap and what followed on from it, his expert panel on fintech, have made very concrete and specific recommendations. It's clear that there are many valuable efforts ongoing and many valuable examples of very good progress. Rwanda and Kenya, who are part of this event, are two extraordinary examples of what can be achieved. But frankly, it's also clear that the existing efforts are not to scale and not always adequately coordinated. And I think that's the overall aim of the roadmap, is to try and bring our efforts up to scale and to try and get better coordination and more investment into the many worthwhile efforts that are out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. And as you said, digitalization comes with its own set of opportunities, but also its own sets of risks and barriers that we would need to collectively overcome if we really want to reduce inequalities and drive more inclusion. And you mentioned as well how important inclusion was as one of the greatest challenges of our time. And maybe this is sort of the perfect question to ask our next speakers, Governor Patrick Njoroge from Central Bank of Kenya, because worldwide, Kenya is regarded as a model in terms of financial inclusion. You have been driving a whole range of policies that have directly supported the marginalized in society to really drive greater financial inclusion in Kenya. Can you share with us some of the lessons you've learned from that experience? Obviously, CBK has played a central role in driving financial inclusion in Kenya in exceptional ways. And so could you share some lessons and some insights, and also how that might relate now to Kenya's efforts towards really transitioning towards an inclusive digital economy? Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Aiaze. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and obviously discussing a very important topic. Our financial inclusion journey in Kenya, as Fabrizio mentioned a moment ago, really we have a lot in common with several other countries, and we have brought a lot of people into the financial system. Now, our financial inclusion transformation started around 2007, and this is with the advent of the M-Pesa platform. And at that point, we had, in 2006, we had our level of inclusion was at 23% adult population. And now we are at 83%. 83% of Kenyan adults have been brought into or already in the financial system, have access to the financial system. And this has been underpinned by the digitalization, particularly of the mobile phone technologies. However, it is important to note that it wasn't just the mobile phone technology that did it, meaning, giving people mobile phones and having them in their hand. That obviously was not the only thing. The transformation was anchored on three pillars: the needs of people, collaboration, and a certain risk management. Obviously, this is now with the benefit of hindsight. And if you don't mind, I'll just go through this a little. So in terms of the first of this, people's needs must indeed inform the products and services that are riding on the digital rails once the digital rails are there. So the technology is there, and that is obviously comes with the handsets, etc. But people's needs must inform the products and services. Secondly, the various institutions, government, private sector, innovators, consumers, come together. They need to come together to create an ecosystem. It is important to realize that you want that network externalities, as it were. So you do want to create that ecosystem. And finally, the risks to consumers should be identified and mitigated to engender trust. That is important. It isn't enough to say that I'm going to transfer money to you. I need to know that actually to get to you. So the element of trust is extremely important, particularly if it is a new system that has not been tested, etc., etc. So going forward, as you asked, countries that are moving to broader inclusive digital economies, in our view, need to obviously focus on the needs of people. And now this range from health, education, agriculture, etc., social needs and all that. And to underscore that we must not be carried away by technology. Technology and innovation, those are important, but they are tools, and they should, and the element of all of them should be focused on the needs of people. Secondly, the collaboration. So building an inclusive digital economy requires all these institutions, government, private sector, etc., to come together and work together, aligned in a common vision. And obviously the final one, as I mentioned, risk management. So the digital economies are built on trust, and any breaches may endanger the viability of an inclusive digital economy. And I should add, it isn't just breach in terms of the fast transaction like money and all that, but it's also other things, for instance, data breaches, etc. It is actually much more encompassing. Thank you very much, Aiaze.
Thank you very much, Governor Patrick. You mentioned a few very important points here, focusing on the needs of the people, focusing on collaboration, which are really two important topics that I would like to explore a little bit further with our next speakers, who are representatives from the private sector. And I think the element of risk that you have mentioned, but also that Fabrizio mentioned a bit earlier in terms of the risk of divide, the risk of further exclusion, is something that I would also like to come back to during the course of this conversation. But perhaps if I turn to Aireen from AirAsia, if you don't mind, I think one of the things that Governor Patrick has just mentioned was collaboration with the private sector and the role of the private sector. And I think Judith, in her introduction, was also alluding to the fact that different sectors are digitalizing, and the transportation sector obviously is no exception. We already know of all the ride-hailing services that have gone through digital transformation. Perhaps the airline industry seems a little bit less natural, I would say. So can you tell us, from an airline business to becoming more of a platform type of business, what is it that triggered your digital transformation, and what are the opportunities that you actually saw out there that you wanted to pursue through this transformation? Over to you, Aireen.
Right. Thank you very much. So our digital transformation exercise actually started more than 3 years ago, and this happens because we realized that we have a wealth of data coming from various systems of our operations. And as the biggest low-cost carrier in Asia, a lot of our bookings goes through our website and through our mobile app. 80% of those bookings are actually coming from those website and mobile apps. So we actually own that data. And we're one of the largest in Southeast Asia in relation to the roots and the network and the market reach and the brand that we have, and being part of that growth in Southeast Asia, where a majority of population are growing out the middle income earners themselves. So we thought that it was just conducive for AirAsia to be able to be part of that Southeast Asian growth and so forth. So when we saw how much data that we own, whether it's through our operations or whether through our booking systems and so forth, we realized that it becomes a wealth of asset for us, and we felt that we needed to work these assets even more. And as a result, we decided to ingest all that data into a foundry, put them into cloud. And from there, we saw we had more visibility of what this data can do. We saw how it can be targeted to improve the conversion rate of all the revenues and so forth. And we felt that it can be more personalized and more targeted to our consumer base and so forth. We felt that we can improve the operational costs because we felt the whole operations, I mean, because AirAsia is a huge volume of transaction and a huge volume of operations in terms of number of flights that we have and the 25 minutes turnaround that we have and the number of hours that our planes fly and so forth. So a lot of that data was very useful for us to improve the way we operate and to reduce that cost further, even to the point where we can reduce that fuel consumption by another percentage point. We could translate to millions of dollars. And of course, this was pre-COVID time and so forth. And we saw how that data can also help improve the whole consumer journey from the moment they book until they return, and what they can do in between during the time when their journey into the airport, what they do in the airport, what they do in flight, what once they land into their destination, what kind of activities that they do, and once they come back, what sort of things that they look towards to be able to come home and enjoy that whole journey as well. So we saw that through all this initiative, there's a lot that we can do, and we felt that we can be more than just an ally. And so we pivoted in a big way. I mean, we started this pivot in a small way about 2 years or so, but COVID struck, and we took that opportunity. That 3-year roadmap have just reduced to a 9-month roadmap. We saw that all those traffic that goes into AirAsia.com, how can we make use of those, and how can we actually offer more things to our consumers so they no longer fly? How can we help them be able to enjoy the lifestyle that they have during the pandemic, during the lockdown period, and how can we actually provide the basic necessities up to their doorsteps and so forth? And hence the birth of that super app that we're working on. And then we saw the opportunity of logistic, which was initially our cargo department, and we felt that we can be more than just a cargo department with the kind of network that we have, the market reach that we have, because we fly to tertiary cities. We don't just fly to capital cities. We fly to cities where many don't even fly. In fact, 30% of our routes were unique routes that we fly into Southeast Asia. So we set the trend, we create economic activity over there, and then soon we find other airlines follow us because of the fact that we have created that many opportunities for the community. And hence we saw that, you know, why not we do the same thing for movements of goods, so where we can move the goods to various cities that nobody could fly to as well. And we saw that it's not just about freight movements, but also about last mile delivery, parcels delivery to support the e-commerce boom that you find in this region and so forth. And we saw how consumers were behaving in terms of what they pay and the transactions that they do and what makes them loyal to a certain goods and services and so forth. And this come about the fintech that we created also in AirAsia Digital. And the fintech that we have created is called Big Pay, and that's meant to serve the underbanked and the unbanked in this part of the world. And that's not meant just for consumers, but also for small, medium enterprises, where they may not be able to get all the services that you find in a normal bank that would give to a corporation just because they don't meet a certain checklist. And this is where we felt that we could provide that opportunity for them. So in our fintech business, we have money lending license, we have remittances license and e-money licenses, and that's what we have in Malaysia. And in Singapore, we have the e-money license and remittance license. And we want to be able to do the same in Philippines and in Thailand, as well as in Indonesia. So whatever that we build is meant to be for the region, because there's a lot of opportunities that we can serve. And we felt that since we started as a low-cost carrier, serving those who never flown before, is an opportunity for us to repurpose those assets and try to serve the same masses, but based on various verticals that were underserved in the economy.
Thank you very much, Aireen. I think this is a very exciting example of how an industry having access to data on their customers and really being smart about the data can harness their ecosystem in digitally transforming themselves and driving a whole range of financial and non-financial services that bring added value to the lives of the people and really address the needs of the people, as Patrick was saying before. I'll come back to you a bit later to get a sense of how do you actually overcome barriers to reach those specific segments in the B40 in Malaysia. But before doing that, I'd like to turn to Biram, another serial digital tech entrepreneur from West Africa. I think, Biram, if I understood correctly, you're in the process of building a B2B marketplace that is going to be serving the unbanked and some of the marginalized populations in Senegal by giving them access to online digital markets. And I would like to get a sense from you of, how are you thinking about the opportunity and the potential impact that you can achieve in Senegal and where the need is and where you actually fit in the Senegalese context. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you very much, and very happy to be here amongst everyone. So yes, after a number of years in the United States, it's been very interesting trying to build a tech startup here in Senegal, where I'm from originally, and specifically trying to focus on the B2B market and understanding what are the main challenges that that basically sellers are having, knowing that we already have a proven we already have proven demand, not necessarily just within inter-Africa trade, but as well as trade from Africa towards the rest of the world. The demand is there. Where we find the biggest challenges are around access to the market, especially coming from a Francophone country, let's say trying to sell to a buyer in the United States, just language becomes a barrier. But then the second major barrier that we also see outside of just access to the market is the ability to actually fund the transformation of the products before being able to send them out to the buyer. And then the third area is really understanding all the challenges around compliance and understanding what is really needed to be able to sell your products outside of Senegal, for example. And so what we've focused on is not necessarily just a digital platform that gives access to the buyers the ability to understand what are all the products that are available in our market and present it to them in a way that they're used to seeing it today when it comes to quality, when it comes to the options available, when it comes to the language and payment options that are available. But there's another sort of non-digital aspect to all of this, which is really focusing on packaging. Because packaging is one of the biggest issues when we talk about transformation of consumer goods, especially that most of these products are produced by people that don't necessarily live in the city, that may not have the level of education that is expected to be able to meet all the requirements on the other side. They may not even be aware of all the requirements on the other side. And therefore going straight to them and giving them the opportunity to not necessarily just focus on what they're really good at, which is maybe the raw product, and maybe do some of the transformation, but then have us be able to handle all of the packaging, either based on the buyer's needs, so focusing on customization, as well as focusing on any kind of compliance challenges that they may have. This allows us, when we talk about B2B, what we also talk about is being able to order high volumes. And each of these producers today don't necessarily have the ability to fund the production of thousands of products within a particular time frame. So we use actually our technology not only to be able to identify who are the best vendors for that particular need that the client has, but also being able to divide the order across multiple producers, and in the end be able to bring it all together through, as I mentioned before, the packaging side, which I would say is also another important piece when it comes to pricing and being competitive on a global market. Today, our products may not be that expensive to produce. Where they become very expensive is in our ability to meet all of the requirements that the other markets impose, but also in our ability to produce at mass. So I think in what Quili is doing right now, it's extremely important, not necessarily in the creation of jobs, but I think in giving, in introducing all of the different skills that are needed for our current producers that, again, might not be in the city, might not have the level of education, to be able to make their products available to a larger market. And so that's really what our main focus is today, amongst other things. But that, I would say, is the biggest impact.
So I would say, if I were to summarize, in many ways, you're acting like an equalizer in the market between large producers and small producers, reducing inequalities, allowing small producers to participate. And you've also mentioned a range of barriers. Some are digital, some are non-digital. You mentioned language, you mentioned skills and capabilities in many ways, but there's also digital barriers. And I would like to turn back to the topic of digital barriers and the specific effects of digitalization. And maybe I'll turn to Governor Patrick to start with, and then I'd like to turn to Fabrizio right after that. I think, as a financial regulator in Kenya, Patrick, seeing digitalization transforming the entire financial sector and beyond the financial sector and bringing a whole new range of issues. It's cutting across sectors and industries. It's driving the emergence of global platforms. It's driving potential exclusion. All of these important matters require specific attention. How does a regulator think about bringing in a smart regulatory environment? We know these are very fast-paced, these are transformative. How do you see a smart environment from a regulator's perspective? What's your experience in Kenya, and what insights could you share with us?
Thank you. Well, actually, I would say that this is the eternal problem. There's always that question about what the regulators are doing. And if you really want to push it, you could actually say, is the regulator stifling innovation that would probably lead to the, maybe significant changes that we have seen in our neighborhood, but also, as mentioned by the previous speakers, phenomenal steps forward. Well, what we believe is that as a regulator, you need to be very clear as to what your concerns are. It's not the business of the regulator to sort of sign off on innovation. That shouldn't be the case. But rather, you should be very clear about what is it that your concerns are. In particular, regulators would generally be concerned about financial stability, and things obviously about, let's say, protection of consumers, data issues, etc., or cybersecurity, all those things. So those are fundamental elements in terms of looking at any digital platform or looking at the entire scope of things or swath of things in the area of digital finance. So that is very important. And then, of course, you look at the product as it is brought. And the first question we always ask the promoters is, okay, what is what will the consumer, what is the benefit to the consumer? Because at the end of the day, you could have 3 million or even 3 billion of these fintech products and things like that. But in some sense, it would be a waste of resources if you did not prioritize them from a perspective of people. What is it that they do? So that is the way we look at it. And then, of course, to realize that the fintech, or should we say the promoter, is also on a journey, and you have to walk that journey with the promoters. So they are not necessarily bringing a finished product to you. And in a sense, they probably haven't thought about the concerns that you have or the issues that you have. And therefore, for that matter, you do need to walk the journey with them, as we have done with all of them. And eventually they'll move the product from, let's say, a proof of concept to eventually, you know, a beta version, and eventually something that really makes sense. That said, there's one item I would want to put on the table, which is becoming much more worrisome, or let's say much more important. And this is the general question about governance of the digital platforms. You see, now we are relying more and more on global digital platforms. And this is even for your day-to-day sort of transactions, etc. And the trouble here is that they are transcending national boundaries, and with significant spillovers into all countries. And I think the issue here is that it is imperative for us to engage in a sort of a global dialogue on their governance, because they will change our countries, and therefore we in the developing nations or emerging markets really should be at the table discussing the global governance of these products. Of course, the point here is that there's a lot of bias in my view on the technology side, you know, technology-centric sort of discussions, and not the people-centric side, and particularly with regard to data governance. So I'll stop there, but I hope I've given you some elements of how we approach this whole business of governance and indeed regulation.
Thank you very much, Governor Patrick. I think what you mentioned is sort of the hallmark of CBK practice and approach to innovation and regulation of innovation, and this is extremely exciting. You mentioned a whole new set of challenges around data, algorithms, cybersecurity, the emergence of these global platforms. And I'd really be keen to hear from Fabrizio, because obviously these are inevitably conversations that have been held in the context of the roadmap for digital cooperation. This is a core issue that's been addressed in many different ways. And I'd be keen to hear from you, Fabrizio, how do you see that issue unfolding, and particularly that of all these sort of exacerbated risks that come from extreme digitalization or advanced digitalization? And how could we achieve greater cooperation in a way around digital governance, which will be needed if we are to govern global digital platforms? What are the key insights from the roadmap that you can share with us on this topic?
Well, I think the Governor, Patrick, put it very, very eloquently. I mean, these technologies, by definition, don't recognize borders. These technologies are transnational, and to try and contain them within borders is extremely costly and not very realistic. To try and erect cyber borders, I don't think any single country, some have invested billions in it, but it's not clear that any has really succeeded. And it's certainly not feasible for smaller countries. So I think first we have to recognize that. And then I do think we need much greater international cooperation for two reasons. One, greater international cooperation to overcome the digital divide. It's very hard to see how that's going to happen without greater international cooperation. We have to recognize that the progress in achieving connectivity, which is the basis for digital, an inclusive digital economy, the pace at which that's happened is slowing down dramatically. There's an ITU report that came out last week that highlighted this. And that's very understandable, because it's been left largely to market forces. It's been left largely to profit incentives. And market forces and profit incentives have got just about where they can go. And where they can't go is to the excluded and the economic disadvantaged, because it's no longer profitable. So we need much greater public policies at a national level, at a regional level, and at an international level to overcome that. And we also have to recognize that the reality now is that at the international level, a huge amount of diplomatic and political effort is not going into enhancing cooperation, but into enhancing fractures. I mean, there's barely a day that goes by without some report of a new sign of superpower rivalry in the digital sphere. And the digital sphere is rapidly becoming the surrogate battlefield for the superpowers. And that's not conducive to overcoming the digital divide, nor is it conducive to dealing with the other major issue for which we need international cooperation, which is to make sure that connectivity is not just there, but that it's meaningful, safe, and secure, and that it upholds human rights. And that goes to exactly the point that the governor made, that we need to put people at the center. It has to be not about profit, not about, hegemony. It needs to be about the best interest of individual human beings. And somewhere along the line, I think that was very much in the vision of the internet founders, who had this great vision of democratizing knowledge. But somewhere along the line, that priority seems to have sort of dropped down the list a little. So we really need international cooperation and above all also to bring in the voices of the global South. Now, to the extent there's a discussion, the voices of the global South are not so present in that discussion. But we also need a new form of international cooperation. It can't just be about states. Whether we like it or not, this technological wave, this fourth industrial revolution, as some refer to it, is very much driven by the private sector. So the private sector need to be fully at the table. And then, of course, we also need civil society, not least to keep us focused on individual human beings. So it needs to be much more multi-stakeholder than previous forms of international cooperation. And that's how we've been working with the high-level panel on digital cooperation. That's how we've been working with the Secretary General's roadmap. We've had multi-stakeholder groups. We've done our utmost to get countries involved who are not usually part of the debate, in especially the least developed countries. And I think that's how we need to proceed. And we need to sort of change the international logic from one that is heavily now involved in friction and competition to one that doesn't ignore the real differences that exist in some of the policy areas, but acknowledges much better what we all stand to gain from greater international cooperation. And that's what the Secretary General is working for.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. So I really note the need for a new geometry of participants around the table in terms of different types of regulators discussing that fundamental issue, and also the need for an extended geography of participants with developing economies coming to the table as well to bring their expertise and bring their expertise, their experience, but also discuss their needs. In many ways, in terms of longer development outcomes. And I think, obviously, as you said, putting the needs of the people at the center, again, putting citizens back to the center and building the architecture of governance of global digital finance platforms around those needs are going to be really important. I would like to go back to the conversation about domestic policy coordination and domestic coordination between different actors. And I'd like to start with Governor Patrick and then maybe move to Biram. As Fabrizio was saying, there's a need for greater policy coordination at the national level across multiple actors and multiple stakeholders. What's your experience, Governor Patrick, in Kenya in terms of, the kind of stakeholders that are around the table, the type of conversations that are happening? How is sort of this broader dialogue organized and structured in Kenya at the moment? What's your experience in that space?
Thank you. Really picking up on your thoughts on this, it is clear that we cannot, let's say, continue moving forward in sort of disjointedly, in a sort of a disjointed fashion. So there is need for some sort of understanding, clarity of vision, alignment by or amongst all the stakeholders, everybody that really has an interest in the outcome of the digital economy. And that is really what has happened here in Kenya. And we have anchored this on a digital economy blueprint that was launched just in May last year, 2019. And the blueprint is anchored on 5 pillars. and these are, a digital government, digital business, strengthening infrastructure, that is key, as you can imagine, innovative or innovation-driven entrepreneurship, and digital skills and values. Those 5 elements are really what anchor our vision of digital economy going forward. So we are no longer now in the area of just financial innovation, et cetera, et cetera. It's the entire gamut. So it's a 360 sort of look at the economy. And I think this is a point that Fabrizio mentioned at the beginning when he was talking about the digital economy. Is it going forward? And the analog one is still, should we say, another century back, as it were. So what is the point here? Every one of the actors, or every one of the private sector, first, of course, let's begin with government. And the government obviously needs to refresh its systems. And I think a lot of governments have made progress here, where you can do a lot of the services can be obtained on e-platforms, and from medical all the way to passport or passport requests and et cetera, applications, et cetera, et cetera. Visa as well, et cetera. Then obviously digital business, and this is very important that the platforms that are being used by are digital as well. Mind you, this is important also for another thing, which is when you begin thinking about taxation and things like that, things are much easier if all that, or AML, CFT, if all that is on a sort of a digital platform. Infrastructure is very important. And I think the point here is we need to be sure going forward that we are not cornered in one form of technology that is sort of, let's say, get stuck there. We get paralyzed in a particular, and now there's discussions about the 5Gs and all these other things. I mean, the point here is that the infrastructure needs to be scalable, and obviously has to be backward compatible in particular ways, etc. But there's more than that. Now we are thinking of fiber connections to key rural places, and I've seen India is also doing the same. So this is important. It's important to have fiber connection to around the country. And that is how those people in the rural areas will actually join in the digital sort of, the digital highway. Innovation, I think I don't want to say too much about because I have already spoken about it. And then finally, making sure that the digital skills and values are there. And this isn't just an issue of financial education, etc. It ranges from even things like digital etiquette and also appreciation of what the innovators should be doing in terms of protecting the private individuals, etc. So this is really an important sort of direction that we've taken. Finally, as I finish, it is important to realize that each one is working in its mandate, but at the same time, there's a lot of cooperation. And indeed, for governments, there's a sort of cross-government cooperation on some of the things that they are doing.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I always enjoy the simplicity with which you explain things that make them feel so natural and make them feel so easy to implement. And yet it is nothing short of being extraordinary. The level of sophistication that you have achieved in Kenya in terms of cross-agency government level coordination is really a model to dig into a little bit more and explore and get inspiration from. I'd like to turn to Biram, maybe to tell us in the case of Senegal, if you can. I think this issue of cooperation, and not so much within the government itself, but between the government and yourself in a way, because you're building this B2B marketplace. The government is also using your services somehow to think about an e-commerce, national e-commerce agenda in Senegal. How is that coordination between the public sector and you as a private sector, in a sense, happening in Senegal?
Yes, thank you. And before I get to that, just because it's a bit related, when we talk about especially African countries and developing countries, having a seat at the table when we're having those important discussions about governments and others. There's one thing to have a seat at the table, which I think is important, but there's another thing also to be heard once you're sitting at that table. And I believe that in order to be heard when sitting at that table, maybe coming from an entrepreneurial standpoint, you need to be disruptive. And disruptive means being able to own something that others are looking at and change the way people look at you and look at the way the nation is doing things or the continent is doing things. And therefore, you know, it's been important. And a lot of that, I would say, disruption usually comes from the private sector, from the startups, from the entrepreneurial sector, where we have the ability to move a lot faster, where we're a lot more agile and also a lot more willing to take risks. And then on the other side, you also have the government and the public sector itself needing to really provide the tools that the private sector needs in order to feel comfortable taking those risks or to be successful after taking those risks. And I think in the end, it's a win-win situation. And that's where in Senegal, it's been important looking at this new initiative that I've been highly involved in, which is called the Consortium for E-commerce, which was spearheaded by the Ministry of Commerce. And very quickly, what they realized is that e-commerce was going to become extremely important and a major priority for the country, especially with everything that happened with COVID. But then again, is the public sector really in the best position to develop, let's say, a marketplace for merchants in Senegal, just because we already have so many? Are we looking at the public sector becoming a competitor to the private sector, which became one of the biggest challenges in terms of getting the private sector involved, and them looking at the public sector and saying, are you here to really compete with us? Are you here to build another market, online marketplace that's just going to cloud everything we're doing? And therefore, the work that we've done at the consortium has actually been quite interesting. It's divided in two groups: the public sector, which is the Collège Non Marchand, and the private sector, which is the Collège Marchand, which I actually am currently leading. We have about 70 members of various actors within the e-commerce ecosystem, just on the private sector side, and over 50 members on the public sector. What we've done is work very closely together. And the reason I believe this model is working is because we're each understanding what our roles really are. The private sector role right now has been to dream big. It's been to identify what the needs are, to go into the regions and do a full survey, understanding what are the needs in order to get the woman that's selling produce at the market to be able to sell online. And we found that some of the major issues always end up being the same. It's a delivery solution, it's having access to delivery companies, it's having access to payment solutions. And so what we've done is saying, let's build a full platform that's not going to be a marketplace that's going to compete with what everybody else is looking to do, but that's going to make it much easier for anyone that's looking to go online to easily create their store, to easily have access to all the payment solutions that are available so that it's fully integrated through APIs as well as plugins. And then on the third side, do the same thing with delivery solutions so that you can use technologies such as USSD, the web or mobile app in order to very quickly identify, and geolocation, I should say, to very quickly identify who's delivering your solutions right then and there. On the other side, when we talk about delivery, one of the biggest challenges we have and where we really need the public sector to focus on, and which now has become a priority, is first to be able to know where you're delivering. So to have a much better localization system, to have a much better addressing system, so that when we actually have an address of delivery, that it is what the person is saying it is. On the other side, when we talk about USSD, having the government support on that as well. So we've been working together to put together all of these different solutions in order to move forward the e-commerce for Senegal. And I believe that it's been quite a great experience that will hopefully become an example for other countries in Africa and developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Biram. I look forward to hearing much more about that experience in Senegal, and hopefully it inspires West Africa and internationally, more broadly beyond your borders. This has been a very interesting and exciting conversation indeed. Thank you very much.
And with that thoroughly educational session, it rounds up the two-session discussion on building inclusive nations with valuable insights shared from key leaders from the United Nations, governments, and global companies.